The night was supposed to be just another family dinner, but for Zuri it turned into something she would never forget. The long table was crowded with plates of jollof rice, grilled tilapia, and fried plantain. Laughter and chatter filled the air, but none of it made her feel at home. She sat quietly at the far end, listening, trying not to draw attention. Then Madame Efua, her mother, cleared her throat. Her voice cut through the noise like a knife. "Don't expect a penny from us. You'll never have anything." The words hung in the air, sharp and cold, heavier than the clinking glasses around the table. For a moment, silence fell, and then came the laughter, low chuckles, whispers, and sideways glances. Her uncles and aunties shook their heads, some hiding smirks behind their hands. Her brothers leaned back smugly, as if her mother had said something they already knew. Zuri's chest tightened, but she kept her eyes down, refusing to let the sting show on her face. She picked at her food, even though her appetite had disappeared. The humiliation burned, not just because of her mother's words, but because no one at that table stood up for her. She was treated like she didn't belong, like she was a mistake sitting among them. Yet behind her calm face, something stirred. Zuri knew she would remember this night, every whisper and every laugh, not as proof of her failure, but as fuel for what she would one day become. Zuri's childhood was a lesson in being invisible. From as early as she could remember, her parents had eyes only for her brothers, Kwame and Kojo. They were praised for the smallest things, a good grade, a goal scored in a school match, even for simply walking into the room. New shoes, fresh clothes, the latest toys, they had it all. Meanwhile, Zuri wore hand-me-downs, the shoes with worn soles, the dresses that no longer fit her cousin. If she asked for something, the answer was always the same. "We don't have money for that." Yet somehow there was always money when her brothers wanted something. She learned quickly not to ask. Instead, she found ways to survive on her own. When night fell, and the house went dark from power cuts, Kwame and Kojo would grumble and toss their books aside. But Zuri lit a candle and kept reading. The wax dripped down and burned her fingers sometimes, but she pressed on, whispering the words to herself as if they were treasures only she could find. She wanted to prove that she was more than the daughter everyone overlooked. During the day, while her brothers relaxed, she worked. She sold fried groundnuts by the roadside, carried water for neighbors, even polished shoes when she was only a girl. The coins she earned were small, but each one felt like a victory, proof that she could create something from nothing. She often hid the money in a tin under her bed, not because it was much, but because it was hers. There were nights when the unfairness broke her heart. She would hear her parents boasting about Kwame's sharp mind or Kojo's charm, their voices rich with pride. They never spoke that way about her. Sometimes she cried into her pillow, wishing just once her mother would look at her the way she looked at her son. But when the tears dried, something stronger grew in her chest. She promised herself that she would not let their neglect decide her future. While her brothers dreamed of fast cars and big houses handed to them, Zuri dreamed bigger. She dreamed of standing on her own feet, of building something that no one could take away. She didn't know exactly what it would be, but she knew she was meant for more. The pain of being left out planted a seed of resilience in her. Every time she was ignored, every time she was denied, that seed pushed deeper into the soil of her heart. Years later, she would look back at those candlelit nights and long walks to sell groundnuts and see them different. They weren't just struggles. They were the foundation of her strength. Without realizing it, she had been training all along, not just to survive, but to rise far beyond the limits her family had set for her. Graduation day was supposed to be one of the proudest days of Zuri's life. She had worked harder than anyone she knew to get there, pulling long nights under weak light, hustling through side jobs, and pushing past every obstacle. When the day finally came, she put on her gown with trembling hands, her heart swelling with excitement. She imagined her mother's proud smile, her brothers cheering, maybe even her relatives clapping for her as she walked across that stage. For once she thought they would see her. But as she looked around the crowded hall, her smile began to fade. Families filled the seats, waving at their children, snapping photos, calling out names with joy. Zuri scanned every row, her eyes searching for a familiar face. None came. She checked again, thinking maybe they were late. Still nothing. Her heart sank. The ceremony moved on, and when her name was called, she walked across the stage alone. No cheers, no claps from her corner, just silence. The emptiness felt louder than the applause echoing for others. She forced herself to hold her head high as she received her degree, but inside, something cracked. Afterward, while her classmates gathered with their families, taking pictures and hugging, Zuri slipped away quietly. Her phone buzzed in her bag. For a second, she thought maybe her family was calling to explain. Maybe they were waiting outside. But when she opened the message, her stomach turned. It was a family group chat filled with pictures. Her brothers, Kwame and Kojo, celebrating a business win. Smiles, champagne glasses, laughter. Not a single mention of her graduation. Zuri sat alone on a bench outside the hall, scrolling through those photos with shaking hand. The hurt was deep, sharper than anything she had felt before. They hadn't just forgotten her. They had chosen not to show up. Her achievement meant nothing to them compared to her brother's success. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She clenched her fists, steadying her breath. In that moment, she made a silent vow. One day they would regret this. One day, the same family who laughed at her, who ignored her, who left her standing alone on the biggest day of her life, would have no choice but to see her. Zuri didn't know how it would happen, or when, but she knew she would carve her own path. The pain of that empty graduation hall would not break her, it would build her. And deep inside, she promised herself something stronger than revenge. She would rise so high that their absence would no longer matter, except as a reminder of the fire it sparked in. Nairobi was noisy, busy, and unforgiving, but Zuri loved it. The city had a rhythm that kept her moving, even when her body begged her to stop. She had traded comfort for possibility, leaving behind every safety net she never really had. With nothing but her savings and a head full of ideas, she began to build her dream. A renewable energy startup that could change how communities across Africa accessed power. Her tiny apartment doubled as her office. The floor was covered with sketches of solar panels, business plans scribbled on loose sheets, and empty cups of coffee. Some nights she didn't sleep at all, her mind racing with ideas and words. Rent was due, her laptop was old, and food sometimes came second to buying materials for prototypes. Still, she kept going. She remembered the candlelight of her childhood and thought, no child should grow up in the dark the way I did. But the world didn't clap for her efforts. Investors shook their heads, dismissing her as too young, too inexperienced, too ambitious. This will never work, one man told her flatly after her pitch. Another waved her off with a smile that felt more like pity than respect. Rejection after rejection piled up, and each one stung like salt in an open wound. Yet every no only pushed her to sharpen her ideas, to refine her vision, to keep fighting. One evening, after another long day of cold responses, she stayed behind at a tech event, sitting quietly in the corner with her notes. An older man approached her. He had been watching her from afar, listening as she spoke with others. "You don't sound like someone chasing money," he said. "You sound like someone chasing change." His name was Mr. Kamau, a seasoned entrepreneur who had built and lost companies and knew the scars of starting from nothing. Unlike the others, he didn't brush her aside. He listened carefully as she explained her idea for solar-powered infrastructure that could power rural schools, clinics, and small businesses. Her voice shook at first, but his steady nod encouraged her to continue. When she finished, he leaned back and smiled. "You have something here," he told her. "You just need the right people to see it." True to his word, Mr. Kamau introduced her to a circle of investors who were different from the ones she had met before. They weren't dazzled by quick profits. They wanted solutions with real impact. For the first time, doors began to open. It wasn't a sudden miracle. There were still doubts, still hurdles. But now she wasn't completely alone. Zuri walked home that night under the Nairobi lights, tired but alive with hope. The struggle hadn't broken her. It had shaped her. And with one person finally believing in her, she felt the spark of something greater, the beginning of the future she had been chasing all along. The email came late at night, when Zuri was half asleep over her laptop. She blinked at the screen to make sure she wasn't dreaming. A multinational firm, one of the biggest in the energy sector, wanted her to present her idea at their upcoming conference in. At first, she thought it had to be a mistake. Why would a company of that size care about her small startup? But as she read the message again and again, she realized it was real. Her chance had finally come. For days, she prepared like her life depended on it. She practiced in front of the mirror, timed herself again and again, and even recorded her voice just to hear where it cracked. Her apartment looked like a war room. Charts taped to the walls, sticky notes on every surface, numbers scribbled on the backs of receipts. She wanted every detail to be perfect. On the morning of the pitch, her stomach was in knots. The conference hall was filled with men and women in suits, their expressions unreadable. They were used to polished executives with million-dollar presentations. Zuri walked in with a simple slide deck and a heart that refused to quit. She took a deep breath, remembered the candlelit nights of her childhood, and began. She spoke about energy not as a business, but as a lifeline. She painted pictures with her words. Schools where children could study after dark, hospitals that wouldn't lose patients during blackouts, small markets that could stay open with steady light. She explained her design for solar-powered infrastructure in plain language, breaking down the numbers, showing them not just profits but impact. At first, the room was silent. Then heads began to nod. Pens scribbled notes. A few leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her slides. By the time she reached her final words, energy is not a privilege. It is a right. The hall was quiet, But it wasn't the silence of doubt. It was the silence of being moved. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Zuri stood there, stunned, her hands shaking slightly as she closed her laptop. She had expected polite claps at best, but this was different. The firm's representatives came to her immediately, asking questions, exchanging contacts, telling her how impressed they were. One of them said, "We've heard dozens of pitches today. Yours is the one we'll remember." Weeks later, the call came. They were offering her a multi-million-dollar contract to partner with her startup and roll out her solar infrastructure project across several regions. Zuri sat frozen with the phone pressed to her ear, hardly able to believe it. The girl who once studied under candlelight was now being trusted to bring light to thousands. She hung up, tears in her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she had to prove herself to anyone. The world had finally seen what she had always known. She was capable of more than they ever imagined. Back in Accra, life was no longer golden for Madame Efua and her son. The grand house that once echoed with parties and laughter now felt heavy with silence. Kwame's business had crumbled first, a risky investment gone. Kojo's flashy ventures followed soon after, drowning in loans he could no longer pay back. The proud family that once looked down on everyone else now found themselves trapped in the same trap they had mocked others for: debt. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Banks called day after day, demanding payment. Letters arrived with red stamps, warning of repossession. Madame Efua tried to hold her head high, still wearing her fine clothes and walking through the neighborhood as if nothing was wrong. But behind closed doors, her confidence was gone. The walls of the mansion felt like they were closing in, every corner reminding her of money owed. Kwame shouted most evenings, pacing up and down the living room, swearing that he just needed one more deal to turn things around. Kojo drank more than he spoke, his eyes clouded with shame he didn't know how to admit. Their arguments grew louder as the pressure mounted. The once spoiled brothers now snapped at each other, blaming, accusing, desperate for someone to take the fall. The final blow came when the bank delivered notice that the mansion itself was at risk. The very house Madame Efua had guarded like a symbol of status, the house where she had once humiliated her daughter, was about to slip from her hand. That night, she sat at the dining table with her sons, her hands trembling as she folded the letter. For the first time, none of them had a plan. The relatives who used to enjoy their parties were nowhere to be found. Friends who once praised them stopped picking up calls. The family that once lived in excess now stared at plates of plain rice, counting coins to make it last. And then, like a shadow creeping in, a name returned to Madame Efua's mind: Zuri. The daughter she had dismissed, mocked, and ignored. The one she had told, "You'll never have anything." She thought of her now with a mix of pride she would never admit and shame she couldn't escape. Kwame and Kojo didn't resist the thought either. "She's doing well in Nairobi, isn't she?" Kwame muttered, almost as if it hurt to say the words. "I heard her name in the papers," Kojo added quietly. None of them said it out loud, but the truth hung in the room. Zuri was their only chance. For years, they had treated her as less than family. Now, in their desperation, they saw her not as the forgotten daughter, but as the only lifeline left. The irony cut deep. The very person they once pushed aside was now the one person who could save them. And whether she would or not, they had no choice but to reach out. When the invitation came, Zuri almost laughed. A neatly worded message from her mother, asking her to come home for dinner. No insults, no cold tone, just soft words dripping with warmth that felt borrowed, not real. For a second, she thought about ignoring it, but something inside her told her to go. Not because she believed their sudden kindness, but because she wanted to see them face to face, now that the tables had turned. The night of the dinner, she walked into the mansion she hadn't stepped into for years. The walls still gleamed, but the air felt different, heavy with tension. The dining table was set as always, but instead of the loud laughter she remembered, there was silence. Kwame fidgeted with his fork. Kojo avoided her eyes. Madame Efua forced a smile so wide it almost looked painful. "Zuri, my daughter," her mother said, stretching out her arms as if nothing had ever happened. Zuri accepted the hug, though her face stayed calm, unreadable. She took her seat, waiting. She didn't need to rush them. She knew exactly why she was there. The food arrived, but no one ate. Finally, Kwame cleared his throat. We need your help, Zuri," he said, his voice thin. Kojo jumped in quickly, talking about temporary struggles, how the banks were being unfair, how things would turn around if only they had a little support. Madame Efua chimed in too, her proud tone now cracked with desperation. "You know family must stand together. And you, Zuri, you've done so well. We are proud of you." Zuri sat still, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She let them talk, one after the other, pouring excuses and begging between the lines. Their words felt rehearsed, like a performance they had practiced before she walked in. She remembered how they once laughed at her, how her mother told her she would never have anything, and she felt no anger, only a strange calm. When the pleas grew heavier, her brothers leaning closer as if trying to pull her in, she finally spoke. "I hear you," she said simply. The room froze, waiting for more. But she didn't rush. She looked each of them in the eye, steady and unshaken, while they squirmed under her silence. It was almost unbelievable to them. The girl they once ignored was now the one holding their future in her hand. They tried again, softer this time, mixing flattery with desperation. "You've always been strong, Zuri," her mother whispered, tears brimming. "We need you now." Zuri nodded slightly, as if considering. But inside she already knew. She had seen through them from the moment she received the invitation. Their sudden love wasn't love at all. It was survival. And tonight, she would show them just how much things had changed. The room grew quiet after their pleading, the kind of quiet that made every breath feel loud. Zuri let it stretch, her face calm, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her glass. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, placing it carefully on the table. The sound of paper sliding against would seem to echo in the silence. Kwame leaned forward. "What's that?" he asked, his voice hopeful but shaky. Kojo's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering. Madame Efua just stared, her lips pressed tight. Zuri opened the folder slowly, revealing a stack of neatly clipped documents. She turned the first page toward them. "These," she said evenly, "are the agreements regarding your debts." Her brothers froze. Their mother blinked, as if she hadn't heard correctly. Zuri continued, her voice steady, her words deliberate. "Your loans. The ones the banks were ready to collect on. My company purchased them last week." It was as if the air was knocked out of the room. Kwame's jaw dropped. Kojo stammered. You what?" Madame Efua's hand trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. "Yes," Zuri said, sliding another page across so they could see the signatures, the seals, the undeniable proof. "Every debt tied to this house, every asset you own, is now under my control." The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. For years they had mocked her, laughed at her dreams, told her she would never have anything. And now, with one stroke of her pen, everything they held onto, the mansion, the cars, the land, belonged to her. She picked up the pen resting beside her papers and, without hesitation, signed the final line on the last page. The sound of the pen scratching the paper was soft, but it thundered in their ears. When she lifted her hand, the deal was sealed. Zuri leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. Her mother's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Kwame's face had gone pale, while Kojo looked down at the table, his pride crushed into dust. For the first time, they were speechless in front of her. The power they once wielded so easily had slipped completely from their hand. Zuri had not only risen above their cruelty, she had taken ownership of the very walls around them. "You said I'd never have anything," she said softly, her eyes on her mother. "Now, everything you thought you owned is mine." No one dared to reply. The mansion that once symbolized their pride now belonged to the daughter they had cast aside. And the irony of it all left them sitting in stunned silence, unable to face the truth staring back at them across the table. The silence after Zuri's words hung like a heavy cloud. Madame Efua's lips trembled, her proud face cracking for the first time in front of her daughter. Then suddenly the tears came. She pushed her chair back and fell to her knees right there on the polished floor. The woman who once carried herself like royalty now sobbed like a child, clutching at the edge of Zuri's dress. "Please, Zuri," she cried, her voice breaking. "Forgive me. I was wrong. I didn't see you. I didn't know you would become this." Her tears dripped onto Zuri's hands as she tried to hold on to her. The same mother who once declared in front of a room full of relatives that Zuri would never have anything was now begging for mercy. Zuri looked down at her, her expression calm but firm. "Do you remember what you told me at that dinner?" she asked quietly. Her mother's sobs grew louder, but she didn't answer. Zuri continued, her voice steady, almost gentle. "You said, 'Don't expect a penny from us. You'll never have anything.' Do you remember?" Madame Efua covered her face with her hands, ashamed. "I didn't mean it," she whispered. "I was angry. I was blind. Please, my daughter, don't leave us like this." Kwame and Kojo stood stiffly nearby, their heads bowed. For once, they had no clever words, no arrogant smiles. They looked small, like boys caught in a storm too strong for them. The mansion that once gave them pride was no longer theirs, and the mother who always defended them now cried at the feet of the sister they had dismissed. News of Zuri's success had already spread through the family. Relatives who once whispered about her failures now spoke her name with admiration. "Zuri has made it," they told each other. "She is the one who carries the family's honor now." The same people who once laughed at her during dinners now looked at her with respect, their eyes filled with awe. But Zuri wasn't moved by her mother's breakdown, nor by the sudden shift in admiration. She had lived too many years with their rejection to be swayed by their new voices. She wasn't cruel, but she wasn't naive either. She let her mother cry, let her words spill out, but her heart had already made its decision. "You broke me once," Zuri said softly, her eyes fixed on her mother's tear-streaked face. But I built myself again. And now, you can't break me anymore. The room fell silent again. The once proud family, the same people who used to laugh while she sat quietly in the corner, now stood shattered, their power gone. And in the middle of it all, Zuri sat tall, unshaken, finally the one in control. Zuri rose from her chair, smoothing the papers back into her folder. Her mother was still on the floor, weeping, while her brothers stood frozen with shame. For a moment, Zuri looked at them, not with anger, not with revenge, but with a quiet strength they could never understand. She had waited her whole life for this moment, but she didn't feel the urge to crush them. That would make her no different from the people who had once tried to break her. I don't need to punish you, she said softly. Life already has. Her voice was calm, steady, leaving no room for argument. She picked up her bag, turned, and walked toward the door. Every step echoed in the hollow mansion, the sound of power shifting forever. Outside, the night air felt fresh, almost like a new beginning. For the first time, Zuri wasn't carrying the weight of their rejection. She was free. The mansion behind her wasn't her prize. Her victory was the woman she had become. In the weeks that followed, she poured her energy not into flaunting her success, but into building something greater. She set up programs for young women in Accra and Nairobi, teaching them skills, funding their ideas, and reminding them that they were not invisible. She wanted them to see what she had once struggled to believe, that they mattered, that they could rise. Looking back, Zuri realized her story wasn't about revenge. It was about resilience. The words that once cut her down had only planted fire in her heart. And as she stood before a group of young girls at her new foundation's opening, she left them with the truth she had lived. The future isn't decided by words of doubt. It's signed by the ones who refuse to quit.